Welcome everybody. I'm Ashley McCormick, Head of Learning and Participation at Warr Pavilion. And I'm really pleased to be introducing this recorded conversation between artists Holly Hendry and Rebecca Jagoe as part of the public programme In Dialogue with Holly Hendry's two projects at the Warr Pavilion, the solo exhibition titled Indifferent Deep and the outdoor commission titled Invertebrate. And Invertebrate is part of a Waterfronts, the Waterfronts large-scale outdoor exhibition from England's Creative Coast programme. And that sees 7 art organisations in towns along the coastline of Essex, Kent and Sussex coming together to showcase new outdoor site-specific commissions. This is the second in conversation event with Holly. You can also listen to her in conversation with Professor Roger Kneebone. And you can read more about Holly and Rebecca in the bios below, on the screen below. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you both, Holly, to start the conversation. So I know there's quite a bit of overlap in your research and your interests, and I really look forward to hearing more about your ideas and ways of thinking and working. Holly, would you like to begin by telling us why you have invited Rebecca to be part of this in conversation event?
Yeah, thanks Ashley, and thank you for the introduction as well. Yeah, Rebecca and I are friends, so it's really exciting to have the opportunity to do this today. We both studied together, we did our MA, and we've always had these kind of weird and wonderful crossovers with work and research and what we're reading, what we're looking at. And we've always had these kind of amazing conversations where I'm always in awe of the kind of breadth and intricacy of Rebecca's knowledge and interests, and I think I'm not alone in that as well. And kind of beliefs as well as obviously their works. So, and also I think it's important for me to say there's not many pictures of Rebecca's works in the images we're going to show. And that's obviously Rebecca's choice because we had so many images to choose from, and they have so much to talk about. But I would also urge anybody watching this to go and have a look at their incredible works too. Sorry, Rebecca, I can see you dying, cringing in the corner there. They make incredible garments and sculptures and performances and writing. So we'll put a link at the bottom for Rebecca's website as well. But anyway, this talk, yeah, it feels a bit different because we have a lot of images that we're kind of going to use as a structure in a way, that we might kind of fast forward or jump back or kind of jump around through a little bit. But yeah, for me, it's a really exciting opportunity to have a conversation like this in a kind of public sense where we can kind of jump around between ideas and really almost we're trying to mimic what we've done, you know, when we go and see a show or something and have these conversations as well, and talk about how, yeah, the things that overlap or kind of connect, because I think, yeah, it's quite far reaching, but also quite specific in a weird way too. But we're obviously framing this conversation in the context of the Delaware, who's hosting us right now. So I'll be talking about some things in the context of the show, but these references from both of us kind of reach quite far beyond that too. So yeah, we'll be talking about our own references and things that we decided kind of crisscross between each other's practices. Yeah, so I'm just really excited that we've kind of finally got the opportunity to do that. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen because we've got the images up there. Sorry, let's just share it. And yeah, I guess we're starting with some of Rebecca's images, and I just thought I'd start, Rebecca, by also saying this kind of, I was thinking about this and it started from, I think, a conversation we had in like 2018 or 19 or something. I remember I'd just come back or was just going to Rome to look at quite specific reliquaries, and then you were talking about all this stuff that you had been reading about as well. So I don't know if you wanted to start by saying a little bit about these images to begin with.
Yeah, so these images, all of the images that I've got in this section, which is titled Relics, Saints and Catacombs, I should say I got all of these images from this incredible book by Paul Koudounaris, who is a photographer. So to explain the book, the blurb is, in 1578, a labyrinth of underground burials was discovered in Rome that contained the remains of thousands of individuals assumed to be early Christian martyrs. The bones were disinterred and sent to many Catholic churches and religious houses in German-speaking Europe to replace holy relics that had been destroyed during the Protestant Reformation. Reassembled by skilled artisans, encrusted with gold and jewels and richly dressed in fantastic costumes, the skeletons were displayed in elaborate public shrines as reminders of the spiritual treasures that awaited the faithful after death. For nearly 3 centuries, these heavenly bodies were venerated as miracle workers and protectors of their communities, until doubts about their authenticity surfaced in the modern era. They then became a source of embarrassment for the church, and most were destroyed or hidden away. Critically acclaimed author and photographer Paul Koudounaris brings the catacomb saints out of the darkness with this astonishing volume, etc., etc. So a lot of these aren't necessarily available for public view, but these are like my interest in these particular images by Paul Koudounaris does stem as well from these conversations that Holly and I were having. I think I remember having them in the South London Gallery, this conversation about them.
I quite remember. It's so specific, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because there's this Carolyn Walker Bynum book, which I am completely obsessed with, called Christian Materiality, where she looks at material culture of medieval Catholicism in the West, specifically. And a lot of the book is centered around relics and the place of like veneration of objects, essentially, and the kind of because like a later Protestant dichotomy of a kind of dematerialization of the sacred. So there's this quote that I wrote down, which is, the problem for medieval worshippers and theorists, both those who doubted and those who believed, was change, not the line between person and thing, or the line between life and death, but the divide between what something is, its identity, and its inevitable progression toward corruption. So the thing that's really interesting about the relics is this kind of hardening of matter, and the kind of refusal of decomposition by kind of like rendering relics immediately into dry and hard matter. So my interest in this kind of like goes back to like this ancient, like what's often cited as the root of like metaphysical dualism in Western philosophy, but I mean arguably isn't. That's a sidebar about Zoroastrianism and religious dualism, which I won't go down because I'll ramble. But this kind of question of the divide between an idea of being and an idea of becoming, and Heraclitus basically argued that all there is becoming and constant change and matter, and Parmenides argued that all there is being, and this kind of like everything that's matter and change is all illusory, because all there is this metaphysical realm where nothing is changing. So they kind of set up the metaphor of the river, and Heraclitus argues that like you can't put your foot in the same river ever, whereas Parmenides would have said, I don't know if he used the analogy of the river, but he would have said like the river never changes because the river is the river that has this specific name. So anyway, that kind of thing about hardness, like that seems to be a constant conversation that we talk about, like the things about hardness and softness, and how this
and kind of corruption and disappearing, and or making something like it's this kind of amazing thing of like this relationship with stone and gold and metal as permanence, as you know, as something that lasts and is of value, which I think is always really interesting in relics and reliquaries. You know, what do we give value to, and what, and how is that shown? Like this is shown through like literally encrusting skeletons as well. But there's something really amazing, I think we spoke about it earlier, about the kind of especially this one, the kind of the kind of the still the humanness of it. You know, there's interesting things about body and spirit, and you know, a humanness to something that is a you know, essentially bejeweled skeleton now. I was sorry, you go.
Oh no, I was going to say they are very characterful, like especially this one. It's like, oh hey.
Yeah, exactly. I was flicking through my notes about something else for this, and I came across this insane quote that I had written down that made me think of these photos. That I didn't send to you, Rebecca, because it was literally like half an hour ago. But it's by a piece of writing called "Shiny" by Douglas Copeland, who says, "Shiny is youth, shiny is fertility, shiny is uncorrupted, shiny smells like the interior of a new car." I love shiny because the moment you see something shiny, you know there's going to be something rotten or scary nearby. The public face and the private face. I don't like it when people show me something rotten without first giving me something shiny to compare it to, which it's really wild, bizarre, but it kind of, you know, it goes back to this comparison between existing or everlasting or you know, permanence and decomposition, essentially.
Oh, that's such a good quote. Yeah, and also makes me think of like the conversations that we've had about the Stephen Connor Book of Skin, and this kind of thing about shininess and kind of in like lack of porousness. Lack of pores. Go with that. Yeah, this kind of idea of almost becoming statuary. Like, and the soft bodiliness is this kind of horrific. Yeah, because it also because then like these relics is becoming like a form of statuary, that kind of like ideas around permanence and art making, and like someone like Eva Hess's latex sculptures, how there was a kind of like a subversion of like a canon of an idea of like having to make works that last into an eternity. And yeah, I'm not really sure where I'm going with that thought, but yeah, just all these kind of like coalescence of the kind of representation of bodies within statuary. And
there's something as well. I mean, we've got a whole section of stone later, but there's something weird. Like you don't see. Actually, maybe you do see skeletons covered in plastic when they're plastinated. Never mind. That's a null point. But I was going to say you don't see them like bejeweled in plastic, which is equally going to last just as long as stone. But there's something, you know, there's something that's like connecting it earthly to like more earthly in the kind of the golds and the jewels and things as well, and the fabrics, these kind of overly highly gilded kind of materials that obviously relates very strongly to your work as well. You know, there's something about time there, and time and labor and a kind of thought process. It's nothing. There's nothing quick about it. Like the time is important, of time past and time to come, or something as well.
Yeah, that's such a good point, because there's like the rarefication of that, because like plastic is such ubiquitous and like cheap material, and there's something about the kind of rarefication of them, and also like the actual, because I mean, because my like fascination with embroidery, because I have like an ongoing fascination with like materials that are used that kind of are of biological origin as a signifier of luxury, but also embroidery and kind of these acts of like extreme care as like labor as a form of luxury, and like the kind of embedded hierarchies within that. And yeah, these kind of the fact that there is like the kind of invisible trace of like the like incredible labor that must have gone into making these crazy skeleton relics.
Yeah, totally. I've got this, I put this image in kind of a response to some of Rebecca's images as well, because which I didn't expect to put in, because it kind of relates to an older works, but for me it's something that keeps coming back as well, because it's a painting by Carlo Crivelli of St. Lucy being the patron saint of sight. And I was looking at this at the same time that I was going to Rome, talking for Rebecca, and kind of going on these quests to find these fragmented body parts that were relics, and actually more the kind of speaking reliquary, so the container of the relics. But yeah, I think there's something really interesting about this idea of the reliquary defining the relic, kind of declaring it worthy of presentation or honor or something like we've been talking about. And I thought it was kind of interesting as a link to put this image in because of the idea of like value and vision or something. I don't know if it sounds like a tenuous link now, or kind of seeing and knowing, you know, the quote like seeing is believing or something. And for me that relates to this like ideas of relics and saints, as well as like maybe what I referenced in the show in terms of x-rays and medicine and stuff as well. But this kind of to see is to, well, yeah, to kind of to see is to believe, or to see is to know, and the kind of the flexibility around that, you know, like the physicality of a relic, and the kind of truth imbued in that, even though there'd be, you know, it might not be the original saint's bone anymore, and there's not really a question of that. It's more the kind of truth that it beholds now or something as well. So yeah, I guess I'm also, I moved from thinking of that research in Rome about the reliquaries and the containers, and almost, you know, you see these speaking reliquaries where they have glass windows where you see the bones inside as a kind of it's like a vision into it, but it doesn't really matter if it's now just a chicken bone or something as well. There's this weird kind of fake and real thing going on, and I kind of, for me, that suddenly made a connection with some of the kind of X-ray works I was making that are on show at the Delaware, where I was trying to blur the boundary between a kind of, or not even blur the boundaries, kind of try and pull the museum building into something that has like these visible elements, these kind of squares of visibility that like makes you think about behind or in front of. So the white one kind of has a imagery of kind of plumbing and dripping, and the one on the left kind of looks a bit like an X-ray. So I was trying to make the window that you'd see outside the building a kind of form of image that then if you're looking through the window you see this kind of light. So it's kind of these continuation of almost kind of dioramic images, and I put these images in because, yeah, there's maybe I'm not verbalizing these connections very well, but there's also something about so the right image is the Fiorelli cast in Pompeii, Italy. So Fiorelli is this guy, I think he called himself an archaeologist. He basically poured plaster into the holes where the victims of Vesuvius erupting lay, and kind of pulled out these plaster casts of the last moments of bodies. And I found it really quite disturbing to be seeing that in a kind of almost a violation, the violation of imagery sometimes as well, and in relation to architectural responses to medicine at the time. So I put in Maison de Verre, but also kind of thinking a lot about Le Corbusier and kind of his response to the medical technology of the time, where there was tuberculosis and development of X-rays, and so a lot of the buildings became wiped clean, kind of visible things that you look through as well. And Le Corbusier particularly talked about the kind of natural ground as the thing that created disease, and wanted the buildings to kind of get away from that. And so there was an emphasis on, like, you know, roof gardens and kind of things like that. So yeah, I think it's interesting to then think now, I think there's a lot of people are doing it really well in terms of like looking back to the ground, you know, to look at is a kind of maybe a rejection of that idea and a re-examination of the ground in terms of our own being in history and future now. And so I think this idea of a reliquary is quite interesting to think about in relation to these ideas of like looking in or containing or looking out as well. I'm not sure if that makes total sense.
Oh no, definitely. But, like all these like questions of like an idea of like surface versus depth, and like I think it was like Patrick Jameson who said that like that all there is like depthlessness. Depth. Oh God, how many times am I going to set myself up words that have infinite like
I don't even know that.
But yeah, depthlessness let's say, lack of depth. But yeah, this kind of the X-ray is like giving very specific ideas around like also this kind of hubris of medicine as like the not that I'm saying I'm not like an anti-vaxxer or like an anti like science person, but rather like the idea that there's always this language of like, oh, only 5% of the ocean has been explored yet, and this kind of idea that everything will ultimately reveal itself to us through like an oculocentric lens of like being able to perceive everything, like you said, like through like an idea of vision, which is like really fascinating and very but also this idea, like you were saying, about the idea of like getting to the center of things as being a form of understanding, as the ultimate form of understanding being like interiority, rather than like which also like goes back to like ideas of like subjectivity and like the idea, like an essentialist idea of self, which is like that I have to like try and look inside myself to find out who my true self is, rather than like my true self always being like manifest in the various iterations of like and questions of like authenticity, like, and what's like authentic, and like an idea of like a suspicion of like superficiality as well, but then also like you're saying about like the fascination with like geological strata and that being like a form of reading as well.
Well, I think as well, and the conversations I had with Roger Kneebone the other week, it was interesting where we were talking about these, like, people seem to like to divide things quite a lot, even like, you know, in terms of science and art, these like STEM subjects, and art is something, you know, totally unnecessary to the government these days, it seems, with the cuts and things, but and that kind of, I don't know, maybe what I'm trying to talk about as well is a kind of cross pollination of things, a kind of mushing of stuff, kind of indistinctness or something as well, and like you said, not trying to get an entire view of things all the time.
Which is like, in some ways, like that kind of like mushiness feels like a kind of like the kind of like secular mysticism that Rosie Brodowski talks about, in terms of like a not like, so okay, so this is a bit of a tangent, but
do it, we like a tangent.
This I like kind of like assimilationist kind of idea, which I would argue comes from like a very like stems from like a Christian idea of like the mission, because like prior to Christianity, most societies were like pluralistic in terms of religions, and that like even if they were like Greek, they wouldn't worship Egyptian gods, but they would recognize the existence of Egyptian gods. And like Christianity, like obviously Judaism was exempt from the need to like honor gods within like Greek and ancient Greek and Roman culture, but that was because it was a very old religion, and it also isn't based on like conversion and the idea of like needing to come around to a singular truth. So anyway, sorry, so my thought about like this idea of like the need to like there's so much of this kind of idea about like forms of like far-right thought, like transphobia or racism, as being like, oh, we just need to understand that someone is like us, and this kind of like idea of like who gets to fit in the category of the human and who isn't, and if you're outside of the category of human, then like that necessitates a level of dehumanization, and it's kind of like all based on the idea of like likeness and understanding, like and this idea that like in order to allow something to be, it has to be understood in its totality in order to like grant permission to that, rather than like if you know, if you don't understand someone's gender, that doesn't even matter. Like maybe the main thing is the fact of like, why do you therefore think that you have the right to intrude on how they lead their life? Like so this kind of idea of like and like Glissant talks about this in terms of racism and like decoloniality, and an idea of like opacity, and like why so this the like that not that I'm saying X-rays are evil, because obviously they're like incredibly useful things, and like scans and MRIs are great, but like what this like you're saying, like how this like creates this like paradigm shift of like an idea of understanding the world or something, and like the ability to understand everything, and not only the ability but like the need to like
no, I think the X-ray becomes a kind of vehicle to talk about these things as well, because the more I started thinking about X-rays as well, the more, you know, ubiquitous they become in how they're used as well. They become like, you know, they're not just a medical instrument, they're in airport scanners, they're in some you know, CCTV devices, they're kind of, you know, they are kind of, they're different kind of eyes all over the place. And I think these kind of binaries of like, you know, what like you were talking about, kind of the expectation or the kind of definition can be a problem in those senses sometimes. But maybe this brings us quite well onto worms.
Yeah,
we've got a lot to say about worms.
Yeah, because actually, like on the topic of tombs as well, like that makes me think of this. Sorry, I'll say this really quickly before I start talking about the transy tombs. It makes me think of, I was reading this really great book about fabrics, and she was talking, the author, oh God, I can't remember the book at all. But she was talking, she was talking about like archaeology with ancient Egypt, and how so much of the fascination was with the bodies, that they didn't actually acknowledge that there were like 45 different like hieroglyphs to signify different wrappings, and that the wrappings themselves were really sacred, and they were just kind of like cast off in pursuit of like the desire to see the body, when actually like the wrappings themselves are really important. But yeah, transy tombs, sorry. Getting way too excited.
No, that's really interesting. I was just thinking about, I think we talked about it before as well. There's this book called The Real Thing by Miles Orwell, who talks about like our relationship with like copies or reproductions and things, and like, you know, how you relate to others. What's like an example? Like, we relate to like knowing about the painting of the Mona Lisa mainly through postcards or online images than we do to like ever seeing the actual thing. And it's like that desire to get to, you know, the real thing, the body, but actually ignoring maybe the different references that's kind of traveled through time, or like how it's been kind of digested by history or society or, you know, culture and something as well. Anyway, transy tombs.
Yes. So yeah, I have a twofold interest in transy tombs. So the first is like the representation of decay as like a transitory state. Well, I mean, everything is a transitory state, obviously, but in stone, which and the other thing is the kind of like what the transy tomb is meant to represent or communicate. So yeah, I mean, I guess the first point is this kind of like state of putrefaction being carved in stone, and this kind of like, and not necessarily like permanence, because to come back to what we were talking about before, it's not like stone doesn't change, and obviously the edges of these have softened over time and been eroded and weathered, but there is a kind of like a slowing of the state of putrefaction. But yeah, and then to come back to Carolyn Walker Bynum, oh yeah, I will say this is that one was wild, the poem, because I just had this image up, and then I did a reverse Google image search so I could put the title on it, and it turns out that it's this amazing poem. It was an illustration from this incredible medieval poem, I think it's the 14th century, which is The Disputation Betwixt the Body and Worms. So this bit reads, worms speak to the body, nay, nay, we will not lit depart to the fro, I think is for, while that one of the bones with other will hang, to we have scoured and polished to, and made all's clean, and we can thame a mange. For our labour we ask no manner of thing to fang, gold sliver riches, nay, nay, other made, but only us worms on thee to feed. Wilk may not savour, nay, smell in no wise. Thine horrible flesh, rotting in stinkage of all creatures hated to devise, safe only of us wretched worms being, if we as beasts had smelling and tasting, believe thou that we would touch the carrion plain, nay, pard, we would it void for certain. Yeah, so it's a dialogue between worms. Sorry, I didn't do a very good translation there, but
did better than me.
But yeah, it's a dialogue between the body and worms. And transient tombs is something that Carolyn Walker Bynum talks about as well. And she quotes Henry of Ghent, who was a 13th century philosopher. When he's talking about the adoration of saints, he says, for the matter that is under the form worm can be considered in two ways. In one way, it is ordered to the form of worm. In the other, it is ordered to the form of the saint, under which it was in life and to which it has a habitude. So basically, his supposition is that that because a lot of this is based on like the coming resurrection and what will happen to the bodies of saints who have been like there's also like infinite discussion about what happens to saints whose relics have been scattered all over the place. But this idea that, as Carolyn Walker Bynum says, there's even a sense that the dead body of the saint and the living body of the worm in some sense fuse. Although Henry speaks of dead bodies coming from living saints, there is a suggestion here that the bodies of saints might live on in the worms who eat them, which is incredible.
There's a reference, I think, in Hamlet to that as well. I mean, really? I'm not going to try and quote it, but there's a quote that is talking about how if a worm eats a dead king, that worm a fish eats that worm, and then they said it's like between a king can travel through the bowels of a beggar, because then a beggar eats that fish that then has eaten the king that has eaten the worm, and it's like this kind of weird, kind of digestion of hierarchies or something. I don't know what they're talking. I can't remember exactly where it's from, but that just came to my mind about it as well. Yeah,
this like idea of incorporation is like fascinating, and like it's kind of weird that as well, like it's kind of because a lot of the like historic ideas of incorporation that I've read have more been to do with like the human being the ingesting one rather than the human being the one that's ingested.
Totally.
And like, because I guess the thing about the worms is like that at the time that this Henry of Ghent was writing, the idea of worms would have generally been like following Aristotle, which was that they most simple, I think was the phrase that they used, like creatures were like created through spontaneous generation. So they didn't breed, they would just like pop up. So in some ways you also birth the worms, like because they just like pop up out of bodies, or like eels spontaneously generate from mud. Obviously they don't, but I mean that's but because also what you're talking about, this idea of like incorporation and like the king kind of like in some ways like living on through the beggar as well, or like the beggar becoming the king as well. Like I mentioned it before, but it's kind of one of my favorites, like Rosie Braidotti's book, The Posthuman. She talks about this idea of life never really ceasing and death not really actually occurring, because it's just a constant reiteration of the life force. She uses the phrase Zoe, which is like after like Agamben, but she says like we often crack in the process of facing life and just cannot take it anymore. Death is the ultimate transposition, though it is not final. As Zoe, which is the term she uses to describe life force, carries on relentlessly. So this is kind of like relentless continuation. But yeah, it's
that's really interesting, because I also was thinking about the worm as this thing that like is like a kind of introduction or addressing a kind of new type of life as well, that, you know, it's I think some people have thought about worms as like you know, you think about worms in terms of decomposition, and then they think about that as an ending, but it's also a kind of, you know, it's an undoer of that ending. It's a kind of continuer of something as well, in a really physical way. It's pretty grotesque in a sense, but it's also kind of incredible, you know. It's like this, it becomes kind of circular or cyclical in that way too.
Yeah, and that like the oscillation between like grotesque and amazing is like also really present in these transitombs, because like some of them, like the first one is like quite symmetrical, and then like the ones that are like French and Belgian are very viscerally gross, and then yeah, and I mean this one is really extra, like I said in the thing.
I love it. It's incredible.
But some of them are very like graphically depicted, and some of them become more like graphic in a way that they become more kind of they become more symmetrical, and they become more aestheticized. But yeah, that so
I was also, your poem that is just incredible. So sorry, just to clarify, did you find it from doing an image search of this image, or
yes,
of this one? Okay, so of this image.
Yeah, because it's actually an illustration from the manuscript of it.
Because when we were talking about this poem before, and I thought we were talking, there was a different poem that I know that I thought we were talking about that's called A Dialogue Between the Body and the Soul. And it's like this poem where the soul's complaining about the constraints of like embodied existence and wanting to escape from like the definition of the body, and then the body complains of like this space invader that is the soul that's trying to like be better than the body and kind of go beyond it. And I think it's kind of similar to this as well, isn't it? It's talking about something kind of immaterial and totally material, and like, you know, something that lives on in kind of different or parallel ways as well. And what you were talking about now also made me think about there's lots of, well, I got interested in there's lots of stories about relics being bitten. There's a story of like the Francis of Xavier, whose little toe was bitten off by this Portuguese noble lady, because I think she wanted to get so close to it, like she wanted to ingest it, she wanted it to be preserved as a personal relic, so by eating it was the kind of and there's stories about the relic then bleeding and stuff, and, you know, having that kind of spiritual connection to it as well. But yeah, it made me think that these we're getting pretty gruesome, aren't we?
Wait, so did she bite off the toe when he was still alive?
No, as in like the relic was laid out. It was right. Like a dead body of a saint, and the toe was bitten off, but then it was said to bleed still.
But also that thing about like, so that is like really, because what we were talking about initially with like the idea of interiority as well is like incorporation also comes into that, because it's like it kind of like goes back to this like relationship of desire and ownership, and like the like looking not being enough and like touching not being enough, and this kind of idea of like incorporation being like the ultimate form of kind of like
it erases the outlines between, you know, two different things, and kind of makes you one. And so that was the ultimate kind of hierarchy of that to and there's loads of stories about them. Like once you start googling it, there's like different versions of relics being bitten. It's such a bizarre thing that happens. Mad, totally mad. What's the next image? Oh, we've got this one as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know, they're all just of a type. Yeah, I mean that one's less visceral. It's more like, like I said, like it's more like visually appealing, kind of like symmetrical. But
there's something quite amazing about these ones, the verticality of it, you know, because I always expect these tombs and stuff, the horizontalness of it all, and that's something I thought about a lot in the Delaware show as well, you know, the horizontal building and the horizontal lying of it. But these ones all upright, they're standing, they're kind of confronting you with it in a way that very much you only encounter like other, you know, living bodies.
Yeah, and it's like that kind of because the idea of death is like a form of rest, whereas this kind of like confronts that, and like you're saying about the idea of like and like worms engendering new forms of life, like there's like the verticality of them becomes like a liveliness.
Yeah, totally. I feel like I'm like self-referencing now by putting in my big worm, which is good.
Oh, I love it.
But and I've kind of you've already but like so eloquently talked about the things that I was going to start by talking about. You know, thinking it maybe quite obviously is death is something that kind of could seem quite irreversible, or a state of like between body and spirit, or living and dead. But for me as well, the worm feels like something that creates this idea of a different type of life. Like I said, a kind of smushing together of things that people usually like to keep quite separately. But anyway, this is the work outside the Delaware, which envisions the Delaware being eaten, becoming kind of porous and holy. So you can see in this image a hole behind the work that I'd hope kind of people would associate, you know, with kind of being munched through or something as well. And for me, like worms really are about this idea of ingestion, incorporation, eating, chewing, a kind of tool to emulsify edges and to offer a kind of opportunity for reassembly as well, to kind of suggest undoing and redoing, and kind of almost small gestures, small actions that can question the consequences or can have other consequences. And I think what's come up a lot is these ideas of kind of transformation, or a kind of morphing of contours. And I think the worm for me is just this symbol that does that so literally as well. It's like, you know, it works with topsoil and slowly submerges things on the surface to below, and they have this kind of incredible role in ploughing the earth and the ground. But a lot of this work was also made through kind of employing flood defense techniques, like the image in the top right, so things that kind of stop water as well. And I put this in because it feels really relevant to our conversation as well about it's like this is a Bexhill brickwork, so it's in one image is inside the brickworks and the other is an aerial view from above. So it's this kind of geological hole that processes and pulls out and transforms material, and it's like one part terrifying and one part amazing, because it's producing materials that are needed to build houses for people to live in, but it's also mining the earth, it's mining natural resources and things as well. So I was thinking, like, for me, it's a kind of type of worm, and all the kind of binaries that, all the kind of, the questions and the kind of material activities that come with that. But I think I was thinking about it in a kind of quite anthropological sense as well, of this of like the sea as a kind of mouth in a way. I was looking at things like this votive that's the lower half of a mouth, and kind of mythical imaginings of worms as well. There's a lot of sci-fi references to worms, as well as kind of like historical worms were kind of blamed for diseases a lot of the time, or pain, or kind of, I think it's because it's this thing that's so much about not being seen as well, and not doing. So the mouth as a kind of whole, as something kind of processing that, and the worm as something within that, so a kind of inside action that's happening. These kind of holes became something that I thought was quite important to talk about, a hole as a kind of processing device as well. The focusing on these borders and edges, but like we talked about, you know, kind of taking ideas of incorporation. So this is a detail of a work, it's called Lingua, which is like Latin for language, but also references the tongue as well. So these casts were made of paper pulp, and the whole work, maybe I think I've got another picture of it somewhere. The top kind of looks like a jaw that's kind of also a machine, and then it kind of works through this thing that maybe looks like a paper press and goes onto a more kind of seabed base. So I was really thinking about this idea of as our mouth as the most kind of visible or vulnerable orifice, that kind of represents outward communication, but also kind of gateway to our insides and kind of moments of processing, similar to maybe we're talking about with the worm things as well. So I was like basically chewing things up and spitting them out, and I was thinking about that in terms of, you know, trying to speak and not being able to, trying to do it through materials instead, which is quite, you know, quite relevant for this. Not being able to say things properly, but to do it instead, and that kind of action of chewing things up and spitting things out to kind of reconstitute it. So that happened a lot through the show, but I think for me as well, the worm becomes a symbol of that, you know, a kind of symbol of ways to kind of undo logic or something too. I don't know why I put this image in. I think it was just to make sense with the top bit. But that makes, yeah. I think it's because it related to this about rocks and mica and seabed. That makes sense. I was trying to create fluidity in something we didn't know what we'd be saying yet.
But yeah, the thing about the mouth is really interesting about what you're saying about, because I guess because I mean, many people say, like, you know, it's like kind of completely bonkers that you eat through the same hole that you're supposed to breathe through, and also speak out of, like, and the inability to eat and simultaneously speak. And so there's like this kind of like dichotomy between like either ingestion or like production, but also like how that's probably like just like a biological, like, sensible move to have fewer holes, and like this like site of like massive vulnerability. And also like how this connects to like extractivist practices, because in like Carolyn Merchant's book The Death of Nature, which is like a bit dated, I mean it's fine, like, but it's a bit dated, and sometimes like speaks of like non-Western and indigenous cultures in a way that's like not great, I guess. But she talks about like extractivist mining is like the necessity in like so within like the kind of 17th century onwards to like in line with like mechanistic ideas of the body as well, like ideas of like the inertness of the earth, rather than like the earth is kind of like a living entity which can be harmed, like, because you obviously you can't then if that's your conception of the earth, then like you can't harm it by like doing these massive excavations, but that like it becomes possible to do this if the earth is seen to be like inert.
Right, because it's not got any, you don't see the consequences or something as well. I had a quote about mouths that I was gonna read as well about, and it kind of relates to that. It's by Mary Capello, and she says, "A swallow is a deep hole opening in the earth, a yawning gulf, a capacity, an inclination. It's a river losing itself in another, gobbling. It's to take completely into oneself." So it is like the opposite of those writings as well, you know. It's kind of it's like another fold of existence or something.
Yeah, that's a really like really gorgeous quote.
Yeah, it's a nice one. It's a good one.
And also like often this idea of like anthropomorphism as being always negative. And then who was it that I was listening to on a podcast? I can't remember who it was, but they were saying actually like anthropomorphism can actually be like a really generous thing, because like, for example, like a few years ago, the EU, I think it was, ruled that fish can't feel something to do with regulation of fishing. So basically like this idea fish don't have any physical sensations, so we can do what we want and we don't have to worry about this. Like that actually, like anthropomorphism can be like a form of generosity as well, in that not to say that therefore things feel things in the same way as the human experiences things, which is obviously highly specific, but that that like we are like embedded in like a like medieval like nested spheres thing, or like this like a connection of scales, rather than a kind of like neoliberal like individualistic and very like specific idea of like the human as being a part of the world.
Yeah, totally. Well, Astrid Nemaisis talks about that so well with ideas of water and kind of those post-humanist philosophies on kind of, you know, that being within us, like the being like water being within us, and how that could be a way of thinking about how we're implicated in other kind of, you know, watery bodies elsewhere, and kind of framing that as a way for people to think about responsibility or something as well. But yeah, it's a shame that it needs to be like that. It's like, oh, we contain water, so we should care about the water.
Yeah. But it's like but it's still a good way of conceiving of like how it's impossible to remove yourself from like a system of interdependence.
Yeah, totally. Tell us about Micah.
I think, do you know, I actually couldn't definitely say it's Micah, but I always say Micah. That isn't to say that's the way to say it. Yeah, so Micah is everywhere, but I mean not in the earth, but it's because actually the deposits of it are highly specific, but above ground, like in the built environment, in a landscape created by Western capitalism and extractivist practices, Micah is like, so what I've written is Micah is on our cars, on our bodies, in our mouths, and the term Micah actually describes a group of 37 phyllosilicate minerals. But mica is used in paints as a pigment extender, in the electrical industry as thermal insulation, its shiny and glittery appearance makes it the ultimate for toothpastes and cosmetics. And dry ground mica is used in the production of rolled roofing and asphalt shingles. Wet ground mica is used in pearlescent finished paints for the automotive industry. Sheet mica is used in electrical components. So it's basically, it's everywhere. And I want to focus on the mica in cosmetics because it feels really intimate. Oh, and just a sidebar, the reason I don't have very many images is because a lot of this research, well, twofold. The first is like embarrassment, because like I was looking at the images of Polly's work and was like, no, I'm not going to put my work next to this. Sorry, but I know it's going to make you embarrassed, but that's the truth. And the second is like a lot of this is for like a lot of the research that this is feeding into is a performance that's not come out yet, and so it doesn't have images aside from some hack images of the costumes.
Do you know when the performance will be?
It's not confirmed yet because it's an online performance that I'm doing with Site Gallery. So the date is that it doesn't necessarily have a fixed date. It's I mean, we're filming the performance at the start of next month, so it should be imminent. I imagine. That's like good. Sometime in October at the latest. Hopefully.
Brilliant. Keep my eye out.
Yeah, it's all based on the Peterborough lapidary, which is a gorgeous like medieval lapidary text. And yeah, part of it is that I wanted to look at, because I was looking at lapidary use in medieval texts as like a medicine, but also what these texts don't reference is that like obviously those people, especially in the medieval era, did not have access to crystals or rare gemstones to just eat. Like you would have to be like incredibly rich, or even just carry around. So I kind of wanted to look at like hierarchies of power that are also revealed through these things, and like mica is one of these as well, because it's in a huge number of cosmetics. I didn't even realize how many, like it's in the toothpaste that's next to my sink, and loads of the makeup that's in my makeup bag. And statistics, I mean, they're very variable, but some put it around 60%, some say 25%, but there's a reason that there's an inconsistency. Somewhere up to 60% of the mica in cosmetics comes from Jharkhand and Bihar, which are 2 regions in East India. And up to 70% of this mica that's obtained from these regions is mined completely illegally.
Jesus.
And mica mining has been carried out in the region for millennia, but in the 1840s, the British colonial ruling powers were like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And they ramped up production. And at the height, it had like 700 mines in the area with 200,000 people working there. And then in the mid to the late 20th century, one of the key markets was the USSR. This then, they obviously collapsed as a customer when the USSR collapsed in the 80s. But then since then, China has picked up the trade. But mica mining was made illegal in the region in the 80s to prevent deforestation. That didn't do anything except decrease already very lax regulation. There's a few really good reports online. Refinery 29 did a really good in-depth reportage on it, and Reuters has a few articles on it which are shorter. Children as young as 5 are doing the mining, earning 20 to 30 rupees a day, which is about 22 pence, and working in completely unregulated conditions. So this like has the long-term health effect of like silicosis in the lungs, which is when kind of fibrous matter grows around silicone deposits, and this also happens in other mining, like mining for crystals, and then also the risk of like immediate death or disability from mine collapsing. So there's this really strange thing about the like the kind of dematerialization of like capitalism, that you kind of like become really detached from, like, I'm just surrounded by objects that have had like far like they've had like come from like all over the world, and I don't really know where a lot of them come from. And also like this complete impossibility of like removing yourself from this, because like Lush pulled out of like using mica in their products, because and there was a lot of criticism about this, because people who work within the industry to try and reform it say that like actually it should be like big industry like trying to push for better regulation, and I think Jharkhand is they're working to make it now not illegal and to have better regulation on the mines, but and to improve like education rates so that children are able to go to school instead of having to work in the mine. But the thing is that like, and I'm not saying that I have the solution, but it's all kind of like based on this idea of the possibility of like compassionate capitalism, and that
there's something very terrifying though when you see it like this as well, the kind of, you know, the particles of it being everywhere, like you said, you know, ubiquitously in everything. And also you imagine, you know, that's consumed within our bodies, put on outside our bodies, as well as like this use of it in makeup. It's like it's like glamour, you know. It's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, and it's really weird, like with things like the car industry. So I started going on only very recently, so I can't tell you for definite, but I started going on a bit of a doom hole research thing, which I never thought I'd be researching, about like the differing trends in car paint finishes, and how like contrary to like the popular rhetoric that like capitalism creates products that fill a void of need, that actually like it kind of creates need. So like the trend in like shiny makeup is arguably like been something which has been pushed because of like a certain product, and the desire to market a product, rather than like because everyone was like, how can I get shiny eyeballs? Like but yeah, it is really odd to have like this intense intimacy with these like products and also have like no idea what like looking at the ingredients, and not all of them list ingredients, but like looking at the ingredients of like these products and being like, don't know what that is, don't know what that is. And like even the ones that like pertain to be like natural, which is like an odd word in and of itself, but like like because mica is often in like things that are like mineral makeups as well, which you know, purport to be better for your skin, or like all natural products. Yeah, so I don't know, it's like kind of like a fascinating and horrifying material, and not one that I'm like, oh, so therefore we should all do this, like, because all of the articles that I've read contain this like very specific narrative where it's like, this is the horrific thing, this is how it's like come about in this situation, these are some of the effects, and this is what we need to do. And it's all this kind of like idea that it's like, okay, so we've got a solution so we can figure it out, when actually it's like,
well, where do you start? Because it's unidentifiable as well. And also, like you said, like it's promoting a natural dewy look if you're putting like, you know, highlighter on your cheekbones, and it's containing mica that's from this kind of extractive industry. It's wow. I think we spoke about it and you were describing it as like rocks rubbed into your face or something.
Like these tiny rocks that are sitting on your skin, like it's really odd. I was looking at like this like product, was it BB cream? I'd never come across this because I don't not that I'm like saying this and like I don't like the feeling of makeup on my skin, like on a very like phenomenological level. So anyway, BB cream is apparently, it's like a blemish balm and blemish base. I have a typo here, which is Beblish balm. That's what I meant. I don't think that's a word. Sorry. But yeah, it's meant to be like kind of like translucent and to show your skin through, but it's also like this kind of like translucent, like tiny particles of mica sit atop your skin but allow your skin to show through. And there's something kind of really like fascinating and bizarre about like this transparency and opacity, and this complete opacity when it comes to the actual production of these objects, which is like an intentional opacity because it serves the industry to not really know.
And it's it kind of champions that, or like aims for that as well. I wanted to kind of, one thing me and Rebecca talk about a lot is rocks, and so I was going to start introducing that, of how I was thinking about that from this show, and particularly at the Delaware, and seeing these kind of strange things appearing, reappearing, disappearing in Bexhill and kind of along the wider coast. And so this is an image of the wreck of the Amsterdam ship that kind of becomes this, I think it only, maybe you'll know more Ashley, but I think it only is visible 8 times a year or something. So I felt very lucky to see it when I did.
Yes, it's very infrequent. I know that much, and I've lived there for 7 years, and I think I've seen it twice. One's not very well, but only one time to this extent that you have in this photograph. And I'd been doing kind of parallel research at the time about hunger stones and backbones, and hunger stones being these kind of these rocks that were, there's not really a specific date, but people are saying 14th, 15th century, were put thrown into rivers, mainly in Europe. These ones are revealing themselves in the River Elbe in the Czech Republic, that have inscriptions on them that translate as, like this one says, "If you see me, weep." And I was kind of thinking about rocks and materials. I think I talked about it in the discussion with Roger a bit as well, about these kind of reappearances of these kind of warning signs, these sirens of sorts, of warning future generations of drought to come. So obviously these rocks are only appearing because the rivers are dry, and I think I was really struck by the words, the kind of rock speaking, in a sense, maybe in similar to going like the speaking reliquaries, in the sense those actual materials, natural materials kind of saying something. And it becomes this thing of, if you see me, weep, or if you see me, weep. So maybe the rock's crying, or if you see the rock, you should be weeping, because
because of what is to come. So some of these, one of the smallest works in the show was a kind of response to that really as well, which I've made a few times, and I made in kind of two kind of different iterations of these kind of conveyors that continually loop around with these either tears or water droplets that from the side, I don't think many people see or realize it, but it's kind of meant to be a type of eye, so you can kind of, from the top, you can kind of see the movement, and then you kind of see the full effect of the innards from the front of the work. And I also put this image of kind of magazine image of these kind of quite amazing sunglasses as well, because it's so much about, you know, visibility and invisibility, very similar to the mica information too, you know, like what we see and what we know, and you know what we do about it now as well. We're kind of coming at it from artists from a kind of problem solving point of view, and you know, you respond to these in ways that only kind of you know how, and this kind of was my response to loads of things I was thinking about in terms of just using stuff, you know, but also yeah, thinking about rocks crying, rivers drying up, and these things combined as well. And this is I put this in because it's it kind of thinks about, yeah, it talks about the lively, this quote about the lively in stone, and kind of what we were saying about earlier about kind of relating it to the human, relating it to, like, you know, our invertebral bones, and kind of incorporating these kind of minute twitchings of life into something that then makes up the subsea, or the kind of the rocks that then are warning us in ways as well. And on the right is an image of a work called limescale, which obviously limescale is the kind of formation of rock made from water deposits, the kind of the mucky bottom bit. But I was kind of trying to use it as a kind of measuring device almost, and another kind of alternative to the hunger stone as well, in that sense. And the work incorporated hagstones, rocks with holes in, that I had found along the beach in Bexhill, and a few in Scotland as well, but mainly from Bexhill. I think there's interesting there's interesting things about collecting. There's interesting information about collecting hagstones in Hastings and what that means. But yeah, I think I was in the glass, the sea glass in particular, that's also threaded on here, became really important because another word for sea glass is mermaid's tears, and so I was thinking about that as another form of kind of ossified tears or something as well. It's all getting a bit depressing, isn't it? And yeah, I put this picture in because it kind of shows as well. I tried to create a physical kind of backbone within the show, using work that was from about how long ago was it? 4 years ago, that I showed in Newcastle. So I kind of chopped it up and made it these kind of like stratified layers that became a kind of literal backbone to the show as well, that also speaks about, you know, reusing stuff, reusing materials, where it's come from, where it goes next, and things as well. And also a lot of what I was making and using was made from aggregates, made from sand, made from that mixed with plaster and jesmonite. That for me, sand became this really important thing that is a kind of has the ability to kind of build and erode, is a product of erosion, or a kind of material of abrasion, and kind of is kind of almost consumes itself as it kind of mocks rock because it kind of consumes rock and something as well. So I was thinking about sand a lot, and almost every work contains sand in that sense. And the outside work, the worm, contains sand from the brickworks as well. So it's this thing that can be, you know, emptied afterwards and given back or put back as well. So sand became this thing that is like reversible, compared to the stone that's very kind of permanent, or, you know, like we were talking about at the beginning, feels like there's permanence to it. and then and sand also kind of has these ancient relationships with kind of healing. I think there used to be sand baths to kind of cure rheumatism and promote sweating or something, I think. So there's these kind of weird health kind of relationships with sand as well, that kind of feels like, for me, a product of rock. And yeah, I thought that was really interesting in what Rebecca was saying about the book of, I've forgotten the name of it, the book that you're doing a performance based on.
Oh, the Peterborough Lapidary, yeah.
The Peterborough Lapidary, which is all about, you know, healing through rock too.
Yeah.
If I'm right.
Yes, it is, yeah. And also it's like kind of like the malevolence of stone sometimes, and like stone. But yeah, what you were saying as well, I think, like with the hunger stones, we had this conversation before, so I apologize about the repetition, but there's this documentary called Into Eternity, and it's like kind of like slightly like hokey, because there's kind of like annoying bits where he's like talking and then he blows out a match and it's very annoying, but like the premise is very interesting, which is that it's a question of like the disposal of nuclear waste in Finland, and how they are going to try to build, like how on earth they're going to communicate to the future not to dig there, and how any form of communicate, like if there's a severance in communication between like the present and the future, or just like a completely different cosmology, and like how you actually like don't engineer interest, because the example that he gives is that there's this rune stone in Finland which says, they lifted it and it says, "No strange men shall remove the stone." So this stone now sits in a museum. So like they didn't listen to, so this idea of like stone being a vehicle of like a carrier of a message, but also like so often when it comes to like archaeology, it becomes like part of like material history, and material history is never like, there's like such a weird like distinction between like material history and like textual history, and how like textual materials may be like, they will be analyzed like in a meta-analysis of like the context of how this person was writing, etc. But like there is like more of like, even though there is like there's less of like a premise of like a not believe, like there's something like the kind of like lack of belief in what the person is actually trying to communicate. So like not only how do we believe people of the past, but also like how would we communicate into the future, like and the kind of, because
like that association with like ownership as well, you know, finding it and putting it in a museum feels more like then there's this, I mean, that's a whole nother talk, isn't it? But that aspect of ownership and kind of claim it, you know, this important thing that's now you've taken out of the place that's important for it to be.
And it's like important in its objecthood, but not in its textuality or something. And like because like the thing with the hunger stones as well, like how there's the ambiguity in their interpretation as to what it's saying, because of like a difference maybe in like contemporary to like, historic modes of speech.
Totally. What's this image of?
Yes, God, there's so much that I could say about everything that you said. I'm just like
I know.
So this is another book. It's a Roger Caillois book called The Writing of the Stones. I'm really lucky to have a copy of it, because it seems like I got the last affordable copy on the entire internet. It's now like incredibly expensive, but you can get a full PDF of it, so that's fine. It's basically this book where Roger Caillois talks about the 17th and 18th century fascination with fossils and geodes and collecting and cabinets of curiosity. But in particular, he looks at like the reading and interpretation of geodes as miniature landscapes, and he also does this. So, for example, you can see in this one, it's like called monster quartz, because you can see like monster's face in it, and it makes me think of this very early text, which was from the 4th century. It's called Physiologus, and it continued to be very influential into the late medieval period. It's usually talked about as like a Christian allegorical text, I think is how it's described. It's got a lot of tropes of animals that like we would recognize today. It's kind of the originator of things like the phoenix rising from the flames, or like metaphors such as like the craftiness of the fox, or like the slipperiness of serpents. I mean, obviously that kind of comes about in the Bible, but it also contains stuff about rocks. All of the entries basically have a description of the animal from an empiricist point of view, because most of it's not necessarily true. I mean, I don't know, that's a very presentist, but we'll pretend that I didn't say it's not necessarily true. That's a very like, oh, weren't they quaint in the past? It was just a very different mode of idea of truth. So like, if, for example, with the swordfish, it says like, physiologists spoke well of those who abstain from all things, but who do not persevere in the end. There is an animal in the sea, he said, called the swordfish, which has long wings. And when he sees the ships sailing, he imitates them and raises his wings and strives at the ships as they sail. Growing tired after racing 3 or 4 miles or more, he folds up his wings and the waves carry him back to his former abode, where he was at first. The sea is the world, the ships are the prophets and the apostles who crossed through this world. And it goes on. So basically every entry is kind of set up with this description of an animal or a plant or an object like a stone, and then a relationship to scripture and how this is actually a metaphor or something. So like one interpretation of this would be, this is like a highly anthropocentric text where basically everything exists purely in order to be read by humans. So it's like deeply metaphysical in some way, because nothing really has agency. Everything is just there in order to be interpreted. But the other interpretation of it, which I think is much more generous, I mean, maybe it's both, is that like actually it's a kind of really deeply material understanding of meaning making, because it's like all meaning is derived from the world rather than like everything being kind of like meaning imposed upon a chaotic world. It's rather like everything, it like language and like spirituality comes from swordfish and from snakes and from vipers.
That's quite an animistic view of it. That's really beautiful reading of how it could be.
I was because I was thinking about it in terms of this this like you're saying, like a kind of like an animistic reading. So like the Kahlua is like kind of beautiful. Like I find the ones that more interesting, the other ones where there isn't, because some of them are like these miniatures that are they've got like paintings on them. They're less interesting maybe than the ones where it's like just a scene.
I think this one is just fascinating because it looks so much as well like a CAT scan or something. You know, you see those, but also the inside of a cave or some kind of incredible mushroom as well. There's so many kind of natural, bodily, or kind of geological references. It kind of incorporates all into one. And then we kind of mess it up by then painting on it, don't we? Gets too far.
It's so naff. Like it's not necessary. Like chill out. Like it does not need the painting intervention. I hadn't thought of the CAT scan thing. Which also is like such a fascinating like new kind of thing in terms of like talking about like x-rays and interiority of bodies, and also like the perceiving of like the understanding of mummification. It's like so often they're like now CAT scanned, and it's like becomes this completely different way, like that we would never actually be able to see that. Like sliced across the body, it wouldn't actually look like that.
Well, similarly, all these slices, you know, they turn object to image as well. And I think I've talked about it before as well, but it's this idea of, it feels to me like there's some kind of excavation or something there, and that between, I think there's always similarities between autopsy and excavation of things, and into finding out more about it, it means you destroy it in some way as well. And like, I don't know, it goes, we've done a full circle, which is maybe quite relevant, quite useful, of kind of visibility and like knowing what points do you go too far with it. Whereas, you know, because these images are so important and incredible as well, but that obviously means that rock is a different type of thing now.
Yeah, like with geo, there's kind of like, oh, like reveal of what's actually inside it.
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
it's still also like, yeah, that kind of because it's also like acts of preservation are usually like actually massive acts of transformation, like this.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's a very good statement to end it on, I think.
Thank you both so much for sharing really fascinating images and references, and it was a real privilege to listen in to the conversation and to follow. You know, of course there were tangents, but there was this threading together of some incredible ideas and interests.